In 1990, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, publishes its first ever report. Based on input from scientists, it finds that the planet has warmed by half a degree over the past century. IPCC warns at the time that only strong measures to stop rising greenhouse gas emissions will prevent serious global warming. And this will pave the way for UN negotiations for a climate convention. Many COPs later, there we are, a world trying to avert catastrophe by limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. My guest for this new episode of Xennials is Gernot Wagner. He's climate economist at Columbia Business School. And he's also a Xennial. So welcome to Xennials. Hello, Gernot.
Hi, Charlotte. Great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, Gernot, to start with, I'd like to reflect on this 1989 article in the Los Angeles Times titled "Global Warming is Expected to be the Hot Issue of the 1990s," with the following subtitle, "Environment, some scientists studying the greenhouse effect say the sky is falling. Others believe the best advice is to stay cool." So, Gernot, the 1990s were definitely a time of increased climate change awareness. And of course, at the time it was called global warming. And we talked about the greenhouse effect a lot as well. How do you reflect on this headline from 1989?
Well, it would have been nice had we paid more attention in many ways than we ended up doing. We knew enough to act, and basically, well, we tried certain things. There are lots of things did happen, like Kyoto Protocol in 1997. There was a big build-up to that. And then it turned out that, frankly, we ended up doing much too little to, in fact, turn this ship around.
Gernot, since you are a Xennial like me, tell us about your personal journey of awareness of climate change and why you decided to devote your life so far to it.
I guess what I often say is, every kid is an environmentalist, right? Every 8-year-old reminds their parents to turn off the water while brushing teeth. And I just never grew up. So I can tell you I've literally been doing this being, frankly, climate economics, even that, the economics bit, since the 90s, since my teenage years. Actually, I dug through my paper archives, if you can believe that that's still a thing. But I have this McKinsey article from 1996 where so this was me, naive little Austrian kid, 16-year-old at the time, no internet yet, trying to figure out what it is that makes business leaders, economics more broadly, and climate be at odds with each other. And I stumbled upon this newspaper clipping about competitive advantage through going green, right? Sort of this very nerdy thing for a 16-year-old. And it mentioned McKinsey, the consultancy. So I wrote this very earnest handwritten letter to New York and got a brochure back, sort of along the lines of, right, so, stay in school, don't do drugs, and call us again in 10 years. And I still have that. And yes, the title was Competitive Advantage Through Going Green. Sort of one of the very, very early entries into this category that, of course, by now is much, much more prominent. But yeah, that set me off on this. It's not economics or climate change or the environment. It's both. We've got to figure out how to channel re-guide market forces, for lack of a better, less nerdy term, and basically work with as opposed to against.
It's interesting in light of what's happened recently in the US with many financial institutions and investors pulling back from promises they had made to be more committed to fighting climate change. This link between being green and being economically competitive, do you think it's well understood?
No, is the short answer. And maybe I should stop there, because in many ways, right, that's the task in many ways. It is about educating. It's about figuring out how to, frankly, make clear that yes, climate risk is financial risk. But the amazing thing in many ways is that, right, so there's this term greenwashing. There's also a term called green hushing, which is actually much more important in this context. So yes, there's some big banks prominently exiting certain alliances, while actually they're not changing much in terms of their investment strategy. Or if anything, they're doubling down on investing in low carbon, high efficiency, and so on. They just don't want to talk about it because of political backlash from one side of the aisle, to put it bluntly. And what ended up happening is, the big ones, the big asset managers, from BlackRock on down, yes, exiting formally, but indirectly, or deep down in the bowels of the investment decisions, basically doubling down on the goals that those alliances set out to pursue.
Now, Gernot, the reason why I started this podcast is because I'm a mother, first of all, and I'm aging, secondly, and I could feel a great degree of, or I can feel a great degree of anxiety within the youth related to various issues like climate change, of course, the acceleration of digitalization, AI and Gen AI, etc. And I guess I wanted to share the message that we also, as Xennials, live through an era of great acceleration of technology and societal change. So I want to hear your thoughts on this recent research that shows that millennials and Gen Z experience greater levels of fear, guilt, and outrage about the impacts of climate change compared to older Gen X or baby boomer and post-war group generations towards climate change, of course. What do you think is different about millennials and Gen Z and explains this real anxiety? And first of all, are you climate anxious as well? Is that the word you would use?
I would, yes. And, as you might be able to tell from the Legos behind me, so yes, there's a 10 and a 12-year-old. A 13, by the way, sorry. 10 and 13-year-old living here who are probably even more anxious. And I would say for all the right reasons, right? So what makes Xennials different in many ways from generations before is that we were the first generation growing up with this consciousness, with the knowledge of, we know this is bad. We know we need to do something about it. And also the first generation with some of the right tools, not all of them yet, right? So in the 90s, we did not yet have the technologies, the solutions. Solar PV was not yet the cheapest form of electricity in history as it is now. Back then it was, wouldn't it be nice if we saw some of the trends, but we didn't yet have the tools. But back to the anxiety, yes, we were in many ways, we are the first generation who grew up as teenagers at a time when we knew enough to know that things are only going to get worse.
That's an interesting point. And going back to the survey, it also shows something very interesting here. It's the fact that despite the differences in emotional response, all generations tend to have the same level of awareness of the impact of climate change. So there again, what do you think that is? And you've talked about information, the fact that we've got the internet, social media, access to knowledge and information all the time. Surely that's what's really changed the emotional responses of today's generations compared to previous ones.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think, right, so if you take a snapshot, I mean, that's what this poll really is, I believe, right? It's sort of a snapshot that says, okay, in a certain year, let's poll everybody across generations and see, whether they believe the science, whether they understand the science of climate change, of global warming. And yes, right, it's easy to see how basically there shouldn't be any differences across generations in terms of that fundamental knowledge. There should, and apparently there are, differences across generations in terms of, well, the anxiety we feel about it. Because frankly, yes, it makes a difference if, you spend your youth, your teenage years, your early adulthood living in a world where it is clear that certain things that previous generations and the current ones too have been and are still doing are in fact pushing us ever closer to the brink, right? And that is a very, very different environment to grow up in than, frankly, the sort of realization later in life, right? Where you build your single family home out in the suburbs and so on. And then eventually somebody comes around and says, wait, actually, urban planning, denser cities are in fact a key solution to climate change, as opposed to basically growing up in an environment where it's already pretty darn clear. And, just to use my own personal example, I've never driven in my life. I never got a driver's license, right? So as an 18-year-old in 1998, that was a bit unusual. I was a bit of a goofball, oddball, right? So, frankly, everybody else I knew in this small town in Austria got their license at 18. I didn't. I left to study in the US at that time, which of course was one of the factors, right? So I was just too busy in college to bother, and I didn't need it. I didn't need a car. Okay, by now, here in New York, right? I live in a city where I think it's like 90% of us don't own cars, and over 60% of adults driving age don't bother with a license, right? So some of us might have driven in the past, but it's just like, why? Why do you need to stand in line to get your driver's license renewed if you don't, in fact, need it? And that's a big, big change. And there's also a generational shift here, right? So 18-year-olds today are less likely, much less likely to bother with the driver's license. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, they live in the city. They live closer to public transport. They live in, smaller apartments in more dense urban environments. And that is a very, very different world to grow up in, where it is, frankly, painfully obvious that there are better ways to organize ourselves as a society, and there are some worse ways that have a bigger, worse environmental impact.
Absolutely. Now, a message of hope, hopefully, Gernot. In the 90s and early noughties, there was a notable environmental achievement. The chemicals responsible for the hole in the ozone layer, the CFCs, were phased out in Europe and phased down in the rest of the world. And this was achieved mostly thanks to the 1987 Montreal Protocol, a global agreement that came into force in 1989. So is it helpful to use such a powerful example of collaboration to discuss the fact for even greater cooperation to tackle climate change? Or is climate change such a vast, systemic issue that parallels are really not very helpful at all?
So unfortunately, there are fundamental differences, as it turned out by now, that make this analogy a rather poor one. Now, it doesn't mean that the Montreal Protocol wasn't an unmitigated success story. It was. It also, in many ways, served as the template of what ended up being the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, where, yes, we negotiated a top-down climate agreement that included Europe, the US, some other rich nations, Japan, Russia as well. It excluded India and China and much of the developing world, and didn't exclude in the sense of not including the overall negotiations, but there were no commitments for India and China. And overall, the top-down approach ended up not working in many ways for climate, as it did for the Montreal Protocol, for the ozone hole in the atmosphere. And I think the big difference is that CO2, oil, coal, gas, producing CO2, causing those emissions, causing climate change, are just much more ubiquitous. So that's one. And then two, even in 1989 already, we had alternatives. DuPont, the company that held the patent for the CFCs, also already had the patent for what came next, for the replacements. Right? So that makes it very much easier to say, oh, yeah, let's ban the offending substance. Let's make sure we phase it down and eventually out to heal the ozone hole. Because frankly, those who profited off the CFCs that caused the problem also stand to gain from the alternative. We weren't there yet in 1997 or in the 90s in general with renewables, with low carbon technologies. By now, arguably, we are. By now, we live in a world where, yes, heat pumps, induction stoves, and electric vehicles, renewables more broadly, are fundamentally better technologies, are better technologically than what has come before, and are increasingly the smarter economic choice.
To wrap up this conversation, away from rising climate change awareness, how do you remember the 90s? How do you remember your teenage years and your youth as a Xennial? And what do you think should be the main takeaways for younger generations?
I remember it as very analog, very offline, which is a silly thing to say in a world where, frankly, there was no online yet. But basically, that's the point, right? So I remember sending my very first email to my parents while I was already in the US. That was in 1998. I was 18 at the time. All right. So, okay, what does that mean practically for, a nerd like myself growing up in the 90s? It meant books. It meant, spending lots of time outside and so on. It certainly didn't mean phones. They didn't exist yet, right? And okay, comparing that now to my 10 and now 13-year-olds, were frankly both are literally the last people standing in their respective classes without a smartphone on them at all times. And that's hard. That is very, very hard, right? So how do you protect your kid, if you will, provide the same environment to them that you enjoyed growing up when they're others are pointing fingers at them and basically calling them out for being the odd ones out, for not having the sort of technologies that everyone else has. And that's hard. I mean, actually, what I often do is there's this famous, infamous story of Steve Jobs himself not giving his daughter a smartphone until she turned 16. To basically, point out that, this stuff is addictive. I don't want my kids to grow up with it. And, I can tell you that's hard to tell your kids that, oh, wait, there was this one person once I remember from history who is in a similar situation as you.
Yeah, it's hard to resist peer pressure. I'm with you on this, but 16, nevertheless, seems very old for your first mobile phone or access to the digital world. Now, Gernot, are you up for a Xennial quiz? Okay, so Gernot, what was your favorite album of the 90s?
Okay, so that's a hard one. I may have mentioned I spent more time with books, but I do remember being addicted to U2, being addicted to sort of the typical pop songs on Austrian radio in this case. So yeah, I'll stick with U2's.
U2 is definitely a recurring feature of our quiz, let me tell you. Your favorite movie of the 90s?
That's easy. Life is Beautiful. Largely because that was the first movie I saw with my now wife of 22 years by now. So that was, I think, in 97, 98. Yeah, that was actually, full disclosure, that was basically my first date I ever went to. Yes, we've been married for 22 years now.
Well, obviously it worked. Well done. But it is a beautiful movie indeed. It's very emotional, fantastic. Very, very powerful. Now, your favorite book of the 90s?
Okay, are you ready for this? So, Nature's Numbers is the title. It is literally a National Academy of Sciences report. Just to give you a sense of the nerdiness of it all. So that was, again, in my my early college years, so 98, 99. I think it came out the year before, actually. But I ended up spending 3 or 4 years of my life immersed in this topic. And it's basically about green accounting, right? It's basically about, look, the way we count economic activity, GDP, is completely off. We've got to include nature's numbers. We've got to include ecosystem services and so on. And yeah, that book comes with quite a few equations to go with it. But I still have it. It's still on my shelf, very close to my desk at work. Yeah, it's definitely wasn't just my favorite back then. It is still very much relevant to what I do.
Fantastic. Finally, Gernot, one word to describe Xennials.
Offline, analog, and I realize that's 2 words already.
I'll go for a third then. We like triptychs, don't we?
Well, whatever word might capture precisely this idea of, yes, of course, connectivity is good, technology is good, and yes, my kids have their email addresses, and of course, spend time online, but you are basically taking a step back every once in a while. If it's the designated day on the weekend, maybe, where you are literally fully offline, fully analog, and taking time to think.
Free indeed. Gernot Wagner, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.